Hi. In this video I'll continue the chapter with paragraph 73 in the chapter on fingering in Bach's book Versuch, über, wahre Art das Clavier zu spielen. And as well I'll be taking a look at some Beethoven fingering too. So that's something to stick around for. Okay. Die Septimen und Oktaven werden mit 5-1 gegriffen. Wer lange Finger hat und kann die Septimen, wobei ein halber Ton ist, mit 5-2 oder 4-1 ohne Zwang nehmen, dem steht es frei. Außerdem aber ist es gar wohl erlaubt, dass hier der Daumen sowohl als der kleine Finger ohne Bedenken auf die halben Töne gesetzt wird. So 5-2 or 4-1 when playing sevenths, that is the same as AC fingering. And you'd use 4-1 when the black note is on top. So if you're taking the 7th of C, which would be B flat, there, according to Bach and with the AC fingering, you'd play it with 4-1. And then if the 7th was like on C, the 7th of C sharp, which would be B, well then the black key is on the bottom, and so you'd play that with 2 and 5, 2 on the C sharp and 5 on the B. And in the left hand it would go the opposite. So with this, if you're playing C with its 7th, you'd put your little finger, the 5-2 is the little finger will go on the C and the 2 will go on the B flat, and then the 4th finger, 4 and 1 would be used for when the black key is on the bottom, like in C sharp, with B being the 7th. Then the 4th finger will be on C sharp and the thumb will be on the B. So, and here's that demonstrated. Weil diese Oktavensprünge, besonders in der linken Hand, allwo sie am öftersten vorzukommen pflegen, das Fortsetzen mit dem Daumen oder dem kleinen Finger notwendig machen, so tun diejenigen, welche, durch die Verdoppelung der Oktaven im Generalbasse, noch nicht hinlänglich hierinnen geübt sind, wohl, wenn sie den ersten besten Bass ergreifen und solchen einmal mit dem bloßen Daumen und das andere Mal mit dem kleinen Finger alleine durchspielen. Dadurch kriegen sie unvermerkt eine Fertigkeit nicht allein in diesem nötigen Fortsetzen, sondern auch das Griffbrett auswendig zu finden. So, I just wanted to say, the first thing I want to say about this paragraph is in terms of the translation. I just thought I'd include this for anybody interested. It took a bit of figuring out, to know exactly what Bach was talking about. In one sense. In another sense it didn't, because what he says, basically the second half of that paragraph is a tip for practicing playing octaves. But at the start he says Oktavensprünge. And you'll see in the next paragraph that he as well says Octaven sprungen, and he includes examples. And the examples are of a single melody line where there's an octave leap. And you might think he's talking about, and in both he says Octaven sprungen. So, when I was, to try and be 100% correct, I had to look a bit at that. And then what I noticed was that in this paragraph here, Octaven sprungen is written with here it's an equal sign, but it's like a dash or a hyphen connecting the two words together. Whereas in the next paragraph where he says Octaven sprungen, they're two separate words. And so that could be if you're encountering texts at that time and Octaven sprungen is written where the two words are joined, basically they're talking about playing octaves. And where the words are separated, it's an actual leap. Because Octaven sprungen, in terms of playing octaves, it is an octave leap in the sense that you're leaping from one octave to the next. And then it makes sense, that when he's talking about how the continuation with the little finger and the thumb is necessary, whereas if he's talking about a leap of an octave in a melody line, the continuation of the little finger or the thumb is not necessary. So in terms of being absolutely sure you're accurate, some confusion arose, but that in examining it, I saw the difference. And so, yeah, it might in other situations it might clarify things when you see Octaven sprungen joined by a hyphen or an equal sign, as it seems to be done in those days. They're talking about playing octaves and not about a leap of an octave. Leaping in octaves. Yeah, so that was the first thing. And so Bach provides this tip for practicing octaves. And I just wanted to say that with the AC fingering, when you apply the formula, if you're playing octaves where on black keys, with the AC fingering you'd be using 1 and 4 instead of 1 and 5. And this can help in numerous ways. It'll prevent rushing. It keeps the octaves even. And a big problem with octaves that may or may not be acknowledged, but it causes people to rush. So a piece with octaves that go between black and white notes will generally be played fast by people. And whether they play it without making a note mistake or something, that's not so relevant when it comes to discovering the nature, the character of the music, or the nature of the music. The reason it's not a decision to play those pieces fast. It's because playing, not changing the position of the fingers and using normal fingering, you're playing every single time you play an octave on black keys. You're playing that quicker than it should be played. So every single time you're upping the speed. So changing the fingering on that will eliminate that rushing. And that can be just as much a problem when you're playing octaves slowly. as fast. And when you're playing it slowly, you might play those octaves fine. And let's say it's an expressive line in octaves, slow. The octaves you play with 1 and 5 instead of 1 and 4 are going to suffer musically and in terms of sound. Than when you played it with 1 and 4. And it can become as well particularly like present in when you're playing broken octaves. That when those broken octaves, you know, with Beethoven often, or not just if you, let's say if you have a line in D major or G major, or you know the way Beethoven will have, he'll have it on, he'll start on G and he'll add an F sharp extra, and that F sharp extra can cause rushing, can cause problems, especially when you have to play that in broken octaves. So the rhythm, the AC fingering using 1 and 4 on the black keys helps with rhythm. It helps with sound as well. People playing Liszt, Liszt pieces, the sound, very often speed and accuracy compensates for a lack of interpretation, insight, lots of things. And you'll hear people playing Liszt, and Liszt is about speed and accuracy. But what they fail to capture is the sound that, that Liszt obviously had. And I say obviously because I can see that in the type of music he wrote. Nobody would write that music if they didn't have a great sound. And so playing those, it's playing those octaves, the black on black keys, too fast, that creates this harsh, it robs your sound of the roundness that's necessary, that was even necessary in the time of Bach, when there was clavichords and harpsichords around, that, they noticed roundness, and the roundness comes from the playing rather than from the instrument. That's proof that Bach, if it was dependent on the instrument, then roundness must be a concept that only came with the modern piano, but it was around in the time of the harpsichord, when strings were plucked. I mean, the plucking doesn't seem like that would be conducive to roundness. Well, I don't know. I sort of be on my instinct thinking that. Yeah, so the sound suffers in like Liszt. And so the whole essence, the impressiveness, what made Liszt great was not his speed or his accuracy, it was his sound, it was the character of the music, the quality. And that's very often missing in people playing Liszt, because they're, it's just, they need to be watching these videos to, learn more. Yeah, so it'll help with sound and tone, expression, roundness. So I'll just play some octaves, demonstrate to show what I mean. Some broken octaves. I didn't really know exactly what to play, so I just played whatever, anything off the top of my head, just to show you using the little finger or the fourth finger on the black keys. And it's the only way to play octaves. If you want, and volume as well, very often more often than not, you'll have people who have no they have no depth to their sound, they've no volume, no body. And that is because the hammers are not hitting the string, they're not creating that golden sound. And I would say to check out my video on the golden sound if you want to learn more or hear and an explanation. Yeah, so here are the octaves. Die bei Figur 47 befindlichen Exempel zeigen, dass man zuweilen teils wegen der vorhergehenden, teils folgenden Noten anstatt des Daumens den zweiten Finger und anstatt des kleinen den vierten Finger in Oktavensprüngen braucht. Der Daumen, wenn auf einem halben Tone ist, kann nicht so übergeschlagen werden, wie wir bei Figur 48 sehen. So here's 47, the first example. And so you can see with the first of all, I want to say that the fingerings beneath the notes, that is AC fingering. And so those fingerings are not in Bach's original example. So if you're only interested in what Bach provided, well, ignore those fingerings underneath the notes. And I just wrote them in to, just to try and be a bit more streamlined. Yeah, so you can see the second finger being used instead of the thumb on the leap from the B flat to the higher B flat. And you could guess maybe that this is an example where the notes preceding influence the decision. And you could think of that rule in the 33rd paragraph where in the right hand, when the notes are descending, that the thumb comes before one or more black notes. And you can see there the thumb coming before the B flat. So, yeah, that's that. And underneath is one example of the AC fingering, and there's others you could do. You could begin with 3 on the F and play the E flat with 2, and then 3, 1, 2, 4. Or you could, you know, just apply the formula. So I'll demonstrate that, and I'll play Bach's example twice, just because it's so short, just so you can hear. And then I'll just play 3 versions that you could use for AC fingering. And here's the second example. And again, you can see Bach avoids, he keeps the thumb away from the black key on the octave leap, hence the second finger being used in the octave leap instead of the thumb. And that it complies with AC fingering. AC fingering as well keeps the thumb away from the black key. And again, you can think of the rule in the 33rd paragraph in the left hand, when ascending, the thumb comes rather before one or more black keys. And you can see he's consistent to that rule here, where the thumb comes before. And again, beneath, you can, I've written in a version of the AC fingering, and I'll play, I think, 3 versions of it, how you can apply the formula, just to show that you're not, you know, you're not restricted in terms of, it all depends on what best serves you and best serves the music. You can, and I would say to try these yourself, especially these, because they're so short and they're so easy to try. And I would say, I would ask you, what do you notice when you're using Bach's fingering? What do you notice about that 5th finger playing the F sharp? And I'll just tell you what I notice. What I notice is, how does it feel? How stable does it feel? Where are you actually hitting that key with the little finger? And I find very often I'm hitting it here, you know, on not on the pads, whatever you'd call it, on the finger, but rather beneath it there. I'm not accurately hitting the key. And I would say try it with AC fingering. And then when you play the 4th finger on that lower F sharp instead of the 5th, how do you notice that in terms of stability or accuracy? And maybe you'll hear kind of differences. You know, I'm talking about, it's not about the difference between being able to play it and not be able to play it. I'm talking about striving for an ideal. You know, everybody is or should be striving for music, you know, to satisfy the soul rather than just set the face in wonder. Because speed and accuracy, they're empty. They leave not, you know, like Bach says, they set the face in wonder but gives the soul nothing to do. And you can be fast and accurate, and if you're playing for yourself, it'll be just as an experience as it is for the audience. And it's worse for you than for the audience, because at least their face is getting set in wonder. And it's like what they say about virtuosity, when it's an end in itself, it might excite at the beginning, but it gets tiring. So you have it worse because you're used to your speed and your accuracy. So that effect is gone. So you'd be striving for making music for yourself, because your soul is being fed in the experience of making music just as much as the listener's soul will be. And at times, like, it could be even, it does, yeah. So try that example, see what you notice. How well does that fifth finger go down, and how valuable is the distance as opposed to the fingers doing the job they can do best? What benefit does the distance, the shorter distance between the second finger and the fifth finger, what benefit does that have over the second finger to the fourth finger? And is your fifth finger playing that black key well? And I just say, as with the first example, you can see the second finger in Bach's, it has to switch lanes. Whereas with the AC fingering, no finger has to switch lanes. So here's the example. I'll play Bach's one twice and the AC each once, but 3 different versions. The next example is, again, Bach says in the paragraph, he says it's partly because of the preceding and ensuing notes that you'd use 5-1, and he says partly because the other reason is you're keeping the thumb or the little finger away from a black key. Well, here you're keeping the thumb away from the black key. And as Bach has said, it's more important to keep the thumb away from the black key than it is the little finger. So, and the other thing is, when you think of the 33rd rule, that the thumb comes after one or more black keys in the right hand when it's ascending. You can see here how that example adheres to that rule. And so beneath the notes is the AC fingering. It's not included in the original example. And you can see with the AC fingering, the way it treats though the F sharp and G in semiquavers is the same as the way Bach treats it. But with Bach's version going to the A, you can see he's having the second finger switch lanes to play that A. And you can see how this is the sort of the beautiful mind logic that you can get caught up in. You know, the thought that the most intelligent or logical way of, using fingers is one after the other. That makes sense. That's the grown-up way to do it. Whereas you can see with the AC fingering, the second finger doesn't have to switch lanes, and the third finger plays the A because it has nothing to do. It's there ready. And so there's going to be a difference in rhythm, sound, expression, how the notes are connected. There's a difference there. And again, you can compare the fourth finger on the F sharp compared to the fifth finger on the F sharp, playing that example for yourself, because that's where you get the empirical data, is trying it yourself, and that is really invaluable. So here's the demonstration, the third example. And the fourth example for the left hand, it's the same. You can see partly that the 33rd rule, when descending in the left hand, the thumb comes after one or more black keys. He adheres to that. He's keeping, it's partly because as well, he's keeping the thumb away from the black key. And again, you can see he has the second finger switching lanes. Whereas with the AC fingering beneath the notes, the second finger doesn't have to switch lanes. And the fourth finger and the second finger are playing the octave leap on black keys. So here's that example. The next one, you can see how partly the example can be demonstrating partly how the notes following the octave leap can partly influence the decision not to use the thumb with the octave leap. So because after the F sharp it goes directly down to the E sharp and the F sharp again, if you play that with 2 and 1, you have those two fingers available to play that pattern. And beneath the notes is the AC fingering, and it's basically the same except that you're playing the fourth finger instead of the fifth finger. And so I thought what I'd do here, given how short it is again, and it's kind of hard to play the short examples there, you don't get much to grab onto. So when you're listening to them, you should be listening to them carefully, because you will hear differences. And again, it's not about if all I had was the difference between playing and not playing, I wouldn't be on YouTube, because I wouldn't consider that there's enough people covering that area. So what I figured is I could, in going on YouTube, that I'd be covering areas that others aren't either are unwilling to cover, because it reveals too many secrets. It robs elites of their superiority, or they simply don't know enough in order to be able to share things on this level. So yeah. Yeah, so since they're so short, I thought I'd repeat the pattern just so you can hear in terms, so that the rhythm can emerge and you have a better chance of hearing it. You can hear the difference between the two fingerings, and this is as well to help demonstrate how fingering plays a role in playing. Why Horowitz would why he dreamt of fingering, why Bach begins the chapter talking about. And I would say after this chapter's finished, or whenever, it's always good to go back and listen, pay attention to what Bach says at the beginning of the chapter, because the more you go on, the more significance what he says, the more significant it becomes. Yeah, so I just repeated the pattern with the Bach fingering and then with the AC fingering, just so you can hear the difference. And you might think that I'm adding more to the AC fingering, but something you will find out for yourself when you follow what I say is that the nature, when you start making music, it inspires interpretation. It inspires expressiveness in the decisions, in the way you're able to bring out the notes. It's that music making that does that. And you might not be making music and trying to add the ideas that people who can make music share onto your playing, you know, like with expression marks or something. And if they say, do this here or do that there, and you'll be trying to do that, but it doesn't arise. It's not something that somebody thought of and thought, oh, that would be nice. It arises naturally out of music making. And so the thing is to start making music, and then all the expressiveness, all those ideas, ways of playing it, they come. If you try and impose dynamics and stuff onto your playing, even if the dynamics are right, if you're not making music, what you're going to end up with a Frankenstein's monster with all parts stitched together, but it doesn't create a unified whole. It's still just disparate elements crammed together, and what you end up with your piece, with your performance, is Frankenstein's monster. So yeah, here's the demonstration. The next one is in the left hand. You can see the note after it, the F sharp, G, F sharp. It makes sense how partly. One thing is Bach is keeping the thumb away from the black key. On the other hand, with the F sharp, G, F sharp, it makes sense that he'd reserve the second finger and the thumb to keep them available to play that, especially if it's being played, in a fast speed. And so I have Bach, I repeat a sort of a pattern with that figure in it. And I do the same for the AC fingering, so you can hear the difference. The next example is, you can see how the notes following the octave leap influence the decision to use the fourth finger in the octave leap instead of the little finger. So this is an example of that. And beneath is the AC fingering. You use the third finger on the G instead of the fourth finger. And yeah, so again, I'll play that as it is twice, and then I'll just play those notes so you can hear. Maybe there's a better chance of hearing the difference in rhythm and just certain qualities, and at the very least hear the influence fingering has on the result, on playing. And here's the next example, and again it's showing how partly the notes following the octave leap can influence the decision. So not to use the little finger on the octave leap, but rather the fourth finger. Underneath is the AC fingering, using the 3 on the G instead of the 4. Basically the rest is the same. You know, you'd pick that AC fingering for the same reasons that Bach picks his fingerings. So they're not entirely, you know, removed from each other. Yeah, so here's the demonstration, and I'll just repeat that so you can maybe hear the difference between the two sets of fingerings. And here's figure 48. So he's crossing the second finger over the thumb instead of going down, you know, playing the octave leap with the second finger. And this could be Bach, and you know, thinking in terms of the previous example, like the 5th or the 6th example, that he might have thought, somebody looking at that thinking, why can't I use my little finger and thumb in the octave leap and then just cross over with the second finger? So these examples in figure 48, you know, they might be there because Bach anticipated such a question. And so he's doing two things with this. He's explaining, he's giving a reason why you're not crossing the second finger over the thumb with those examples, and So in order to keep 5-1 on the octave leap, because you can't cross it over when the thumb is on a black key. The one hand he's doing that, and he's as well showing that it is possible to cross over the thumb. And so here it's, and that's why it's good to look at the examples and consider it, not just to, you know, be racing through the text to get it, just to say you've read it or to get to the end. It always seems like the best stuff is always at the end with these things, but it's, and I think generally it's good to race through it to get to the end, because then you can get that out of your system. And then you can return to it with sort of the patience to take your time to take in the scenery. So what you're getting here is Bach is saying a lot more with his examples than is just in the text. You're getting an insight into how he's thinking, into the person behind, you know, you're learning how Bach thinks. And if you think of in terms of the entire book, is that not an attractive proposition, that you could start to learn how Bach actually thinks, and maybe even start anticipating what he says, because you're learning, like, I mean, one is learning to think like he thinks and is able to see this stuff the way he sees it. So we're learning something about Bach and how he thinks here with that. And and you can learn the type of person he's talking to. It's the type of person who actively thinks as well, along with, you know, he's not just letting Bach do all the thinking and spoon feed him it. The person Bach is imagining is actively thinking, is observing and asking, hold on, wait a second, what's this? That's who Bach is speaking to. So if you're that type of person, you are going to hear the most of what Bach is saying, because the people who are spoon feeding, they'll only hear the stuff that Bach actually spoon feeds. They'll miss everything else. But Bach is not talking to you if you're, you know, one of those people who allow themselves to be spoon fed all the time. He doesn't talk to you. So if you want to hear what Bach has to say, you can't be spoon fed. And part of that means trying these things for yourself. Yeah, so, okay, so here's the demonstration. Yeah, sorry if that sounded preachy. But I think it's a valid point. I mean, you're getting closer to Bach here. He's coming alive. His words are being spoken, and there's a chance of learning how he thinks. You can see none of these examples, there's more to them than meets the eye. He's adding. He's adding with his examples to the information he's providing in the text. They enrich the learning experience. They add to your opportunity to gain Bach's insight. So here's the first example. And you could use this second finger with the AC fingering as well. Underneath you'll see that I would say that the third finger is preferable. But again, it's not the difference between being able to play it or not play it. That's what I'm not talking about that here. So I'll just repeat that pattern in notes, not in that same rhythm. I'll play it as it is and then repeat it in a pattern. It's just so there's a chance to hear how it is. And here's the second example of figure 48. And yeah, you can see again it's the same just for the left hand, and with the AC fingering you'll use the third finger instead of the second finger. But you can use the second finger on a white key with the AC fingering, so that would not necessarily be ruled out Bach's version. And so here's the demonstration. Okay, and so I just wanted to look at an example of Beethoven's fingering in Opus 2, number 2. And this is from bar 84 to 89. And here it is on the screen. And so there are not many examples where Bach included fingering in his works. So I would say any time he does, they're of extreme, they're very relevant and very important. And I think this is probably, I mean, in terms of classical piano terms, is quite maybe a notorious sort of a situation. In terms, and I know, you know, Gay Henley Verlag, right? That's this one here. They include a footnote for that fingering, and they say the footnote says Beethoven's fingering in italics. No, Beethoven's fingering, based on the narrower piano keys of that time, and basically, I disagree with that footnote. And as well, I don't agree with the way they present that as fact. And I remember reading Alfred Brendel talking, you know, writing about this passage here with the fingering, and the only thing I remember was at the end he says, he kind of asked the question, is this an instance of Beethoven, the practical joker, you know, playing practical jokes? And I know that's light-hearted, but it's, you know, and I'm sure Alfred Brendel as well talked about the narrower keys at the time and how the fingering is based on that. And I can imagine Beethoven, when he's writing that fingering, I mean, I can imagine him wondering if we deserve it. Yeah, so I just wanted to have a look at that in connection with the paragraph that we've just read, paragraph 75. And so if you look at Beethoven's fingering, you can see how he's using the second finger instead of the thumb in leaps of an octave, depending on the continuation. And then you can see there on the G sharp how he keeps the thumb away from the black key. And as it goes down, the next G sharp again, you can see him keeping the thumb away from the black key. You can see him using the second finger instead of the thumb in leaps of an octave. And if you compare it to the examples provided by Bach, you can see the similarity of the second finger being and the little finger in the octave leaps. And so I would say, I mean, my answer to this fingering would be, I'd have many things to say, but for now I'm just sticking with the fingering. So one of the things I'd say, instead of saying Beethoven's fingering based on the narrower piano keys of that time, I would say to you, you could look through this chapter on what we said and try and find that spot where Bach says, based on the narrower keys of our time, we're going to have this fingering. Or this fingering is because of the narrower keys. And you might agree that Bach is very thoughtful and insightful, and you know, he's not casual about the fingering, and he provides reasons, more reasons than a lot of people would provide for what he says. And you can see how, you know, you can look back and you can see the reasons he gives for fingering decisions. And so I would say Beethoven's fingering is based on, to some part, on paragraph 78 of Bach's Versuch, über, wahre, Art das Clavier zu spielen. And so you can imagine that Beethoven has read that paragraph and that is in his mind while writing that fingering. And there's that saying, you know, I know where he's coming from, or I can see where he's coming from. Well, here you are seeing where Beethoven is coming from. You're closer to Beethoven. Here is evidence that he spent time with that paragraph just as we spent time with it. And I would say that you know, this is an occasion where Beethoven is close, where we're close to Beethoven. And I would say, how close are we to Beethoven in those other moments without us realizing it? And it's a bit like, you know, the Karate Kid with Mr. Miyagi, you know, where Danielson is doing the chores and doesn't realize how close he is to karate. That we're looking at these with Bach. We're looking at this book and what Bach says, not realizing how close we are to Beethoven. And underneath is the AC fingering. And so with the AC fingering, I'd use the third finger on that B instead of the second finger, you know, in the second beat of the first of bar 84. And then the fourth finger on the higher G sharp instead of the fifth finger. And the same further down. And then going up again, you can see how Beethoven is keeping the thumb away from the black keys, and he's using the second finger instead of the thumb in the leap of an octave, and how it's how close it is to that paragraph we've just read with Bach. So I would say based on paragraph 78 in Bach's Versuch, über, wahre, Art das Clavier zu spielen, in the chapter on fingering, as opposed to it being based on the narrower piano keys of that time. And I would say as well with the AC fingering that even though I alter Beethoven's fingering, or even though the AC fingering system alters Beethoven's fingering, it stays true to the character, the nature of the music. It stays just as true to that as Beethoven's fingering. And why did Beethoven include that fingering? Why did he feel it important? And was it a practical joke? And was it based on the narrower keys? Because if you look at the AC fingering, it should be even more ridiculous. Because if you're like I said in the last video, holding distance as your one true God, whereas I don't. I hold the fingers doing the jobs they can do best as the one true God. So the distance I have to travel in order to play that passage is greater than the distance that has to be traveled when you're using Beethoven's fingering, which basically they're already saying, Henley Verlag and Alfred Brendel, they're already saying it's ridiculous or that it's not relevant anymore because the piano keys were narrower. And I would as well wonder, how narrow were the piano keys for La Campanella? They must have been really, really narrow. Yeah, so the AC fingering stays true to the character of the music. And was it not? And I can imagine Beethoven wondering, do we deserve it? You know, maybe I'll just give them the notes. Let them have the notes. But I am just like I'm thankful for Bach saying about the unnaturalness of that, you know, of the thumb coming in on the D in A major instead of on the E where there's two black notes following. Even though he could have swept that under the rug because it weakens his argument, his integrity and his honesty were, you know, ultimately good. I'm happy. For me, I'm grateful for Beethoven for providing that fingering because it helps me. It's like, you know, it's like a voice of reason. And I would say, you know, I can imagine a lot of people, professionals, I'm talking about professionals here, not, you know, students. But I mean, you can use the AC fingering. You don't have to be a professional. It's not dependent on how long you've been playing. Normal fingering is rather dependent on that. You know, you're learning to, you know, as Chopin said, walk on your hands instead of on your feet. With the AC fingering, you're learning to walk on your feet. So you can do that at the age of 3, basically. No, not the piano though, but yeah. So I'm grateful that it helps somebody like me. Beethoven empowers somebody like me rather than the others, because it's important. And I would say, yeah, so the professionals, they might, I don't know, I haven't looked into this, but they might divide up those octaves between the hands. And I would say when you do that, what you're doing is turning an event, a musical event, into a musical non-event. And you're completely missing the point. And I would say, you know, this footnote of that it's based on the narrower piano keys of that time. I would say this is a good example of how mediocrity attacks genius. And mediocrity, it imposes its own stamp on genius. It quenches genius and just dulls it out. And it always poses as the grown-up, the mature approach, but it's not. It's mediocrity. And I would say that this is a good example of that, in how genius is always being attacked by mediocrity. It's mediocrity. The instinct of mediocrity is to extinguish genius whenever they see it. So I'm grateful. And in terms of it being based on the narrower keys, so the distance the AC fingering forces you to travel is greater than the distance Beethoven's fingering requires you to travel, your fingers to travel. So it should be even more impossible for me to play this with the AC fingering. So that would mean that the piano keys then-a-days would have, in order to facilitate the AC fingering, the piano keys would need to be even narrower than they were if the fingering is based on the narrow keys. And I'll play a demonstration of it. And I don't know if I should be saying this, but I just want to say that, I mean, I've never, learned this sonata, and I'd be interested in doing it, but I thought of it yesterday, and I just thought I'd play that bit just to demonstrate, and yeah, like I said, I don't know if I should be saying that or not, but I guess I say it to show it. I don't need to practice that. If you're performing that in and being true to the nature of the music, to the character of the music, how long would this section, how many months would this section need if you're in the cage practicing with the metronome, breaking it up into rhythms, doing all these sorts of gymnastics or acrobatics in the belief that it's helping you learn to play it, or that memory that your muscle possesses in their little muscle brains, that they that you can do that. So yeah, so if there was any validity to that footnote, that the fingering is based on the narrower piano keys at that time, so that would mean it's not based on that paragraph in Bach. But I don't know if you could. I don't know. Do you see any relationship between Beethoven's fingering and what Bach, and the examples that Bach provided, and what Bach said about using the second finger instead of the thumb and the leaps of an octave? Why did Beethoven include that fingering there? When he, most of the time in all his piano sonatas, there's very few instances where he provided fingering. It was important. And who did he do it for? If he could have seen that footnote, or if he could have heard what Alfred Brendel said, calling him a practical joker, and I know it was it was at the end and it was meant in like a kind of a light-hearted thing, but still, what if Beethoven was touchy? Would that have convinced him to, nah, I'm not going to share that fingering with them. Let them have the notes. And that's good, and that's all they deserve, is the notes. Because look how they treat what I do provide, so yeah, so I don't know how this comes across, but we're close to Beethoven. We are in going through this, in taking our time to observe what is in this book, we are having the same experience that Beethoven had. And I think it's evident here in that in this fingering that he provides, which I am very grateful he provides. Yeah, so here's the demonstration of it with the AC fingering, which should be impossible, should be even more absurd or ludicrous, given that the piano keys on this piano here are not narrower than normal modern day piano keys, and that the distances I have to travel in order to play that are greater than the distances Beethoven's fingering, ridiculous practical joke fingering, requires. Yeah, so here it is. So that's it for, this is like the next subsection of the chapter, and the next section will be about chords. 3-note chords, 4-note chords, 5-note chords. So if you appreciate the insight into where Beethoven is coming from, maybe you could, a like would be very much appreciated, and I'd be very happy if you were to subscribe to the channel. Thanks. Bye.